Imagine this. It is the dead of night somewhere off the coast of China. The year is 1945. A lone American submarine is creeping through water so shallow that the ocean floor is barely 30 feet below its keel. All around it, hidden beneath the black surface, are mines, jagged rocks, and uncharted hazards that could tear the hull wide open in seconds. The crew inside is silent. Some of them are praying. Some of them are simply gripping whatever is closest to them and holding on. And at the center of all of it, one man is pressed against the periscope, watching more than 30 Japanese ships sitting quietly at anchor just ahead, completely unaware that death is already on its way. His name is Commander Eugene Fluckey, and what he is about to do will go down as one of the most audacious, most reckless, and most brilliant submarine attacks in the entire history of naval warfare. When his torpedoes hit their targets that night, one of those ships, a massive Japanese ammunition vessel, erupted in a fireball so enormous that observers on distant ships thought a volcano had just opened up in the middle of the harbor. Shells launched themselves into the sky. Fire painted the clouds orange for miles in every direction. And when the smoke finally cleared, Commander Fluckey somehow had his submarine halfway to safety. Every single crewman aboard alive and unharmed. This is that story. Welcome. Today we are going deep into one of the most incredible, most underappreciated chapters of the entire Pacific War. We are going to talk about the USS Barb, about the man who commanded her, and about a single night that changed how the world understood what a submarine could do. And I promise you, by the time we are done here, you will not be able to believe that more people do not know this story. Because this is not just a tale of war. This is a story about what happens when one man refuses to accept limitations, when one crew decides that the impossible is really just the untried. So let us start from the very beginning. Let us go back to before the USS Barb became a legend. Because even great stories have humble origins, and the Barb was no exception. The USS Barb was a Gato-class submarine, laid down in June of 1941 at the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. She was commissioned on July 8, 1942, just a little over 7 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor had brought the United States roaring into the Second World War. She was 311 feet long, displaced about 1,810 tons on the surface, and carried 10 torpedo tubes along with a deck gun and machine guns. On paper, she was a capable, well-built fighting vessel. In reality, for the first couple of years of her existence, she was something of a disappointment. Under her initial commanding officers, the Barb conducted 6 war patrols and managed to sink just 1 confirmed enemy ship. 1. In 6 entire patrols. That is a number that would make any submarine commander hang his head in frustration. But it would also make a certain ambitious, creative, and absolutely fearless young officer very interested indeed in getting his hands on that ship. Because where others saw a poor performer, Eugene Fluckey saw potential waiting to be unlocked. Let us talk about Eugene Fluckey for a moment, because you really do need to understand this man to understand what happened next. Born in Washington, D.C. on October 5, 1913, Fluckey was the kind of person who simply refused to accept that anything was out of reach. When he was 10 years old, he heard a radio speech by President Calvin Coolidge talking about persistence as the secret to success, and that message apparently lodged itself so deep in his soul that he named his dog Calvin Coolidge and spent the rest of his life proving the point. He finished high school at the age of 15. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1935. He went through submarine school in 1938, and by the time the war started, he was already developing a reputation as someone who thought differently, who pushed harder, and who genuinely did not understand the concept of playing it safe. His nickname, which he had earned before he ever fired a torpedo in anger, was Lucky Fluckey. And as you will see, luck had very little to do with it. In May of 1944, Fluckey got what he wanted. He was given command of the USS Barb. And even before he took her out on his first patrol, he did something that tells you everything you need to know about the man. He made a promise to the Pacific Fleet submarine commander. He promised that on his very first patrol with the Barb, he would sink 5 Japanese ships. 5 ships. On his first patrol with a submarine that had sunk exactly 1 ship in 6 previous outings. Everyone around him probably thought he had either extraordinary confidence or absolutely no grip on reality. But Eugene Fluckey had a plan. Actually, he had something better than a plan. He had a philosophy, and that philosophy was about to turn the USS Barb into one of the most feared vessels in the entire Pacific. Flucky's approach to submarine warfare was fundamentally different from the conventional doctrine of his time. Most submarine commanders believed that the safest and most effective tactic was to submerge and wait, to lie quietly below the surface and let the enemy come to you. It was a cautious, conservative approach, and it made a certain kind of sense. But Flucky disagreed. He believed that a submarine should operate like a surface predator, aggressively pursuing the enemy, attacking on the surface at night when speed and maneuverability gave the sub an advantage over slower, less nimble merchant vessels. He had studied the tactics of Otto Kretschmer, Germany's most successful U-boat commander, and he had drawn his own conclusions. The submarine that moved, that hunted, that refused to stay still, that was the submarine that would win. On his first patrol under this philosophy, Flucky only submerged the Barb for a grand total of one single day out of the entire 52-day patrol. And when he came back, he had his 5 ships. He had made good on his promise. The Barb was on the scoreboard. What followed over the next several patrols was a remarkable transformation. Under Flucky's command, the Barb became a ship that seemed to operate by different rules than every other submarine in the Pacific Fleet. She was faster, she was bolder, she was more creative, and she was extraordinarily effective. Flucky had an ability to inspire his crew that bordered on something almost mystical. The men of the Barb believed in him completely. They trusted him with their lives, and they willingly followed him into situations that would have caused most rational human beings to turn around and go home. He in turn treated them not merely as crew members but as a family. He knew their names, their histories, their hopes. He genuinely cared about every single man aboard, and they knew it. That combination of tactical brilliance and human connection created a fighting unit that was truly extraordinary. By the end of his 8th patrol, Flucky was already a decorated and celebrated commander. But his greatest moment was still ahead of him. Let us set the scene for the patrol that would define everything. We are now in December of 1944. The war in the Pacific has been grinding on for 3 years. American forces are island hopping toward Japan, and the strategic bombing campaign is beginning to strangle the Japanese home islands. But the Japanese military still controls vast stretches of territory across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, and their shipping convoys, carrying supplies, ammunition, and troops, continue to move through the waters of the East China Sea. It is into these waters that the USS Barb departs on her 11th war patrol in December of 1944, operating as part of a wolf pack alongside the submarines USS Queenfish and USS Pakuta. They call themselves Lachlan's Loopers, after the senior commander in the group. But very quickly it will become clear that the Barb under Flucky is the most dangerous animal in this particular pack. The patrol begins promisingly enough. On January 1st, 1945, the Barb sinks a small Japanese vessel with gunfire. A week later, on January 8th, while cruising in the northern reaches of the Formosa Strait, she picks up a large Japanese convoy steaming south. What follows is a 2-hour running night battle, exactly the kind of fight Flucky was built for. He attacks the convoy with furious energy, firing torpedoes from both his bow and stern tubes, and achieving devastating results. Among the ships he hits is a large enemy ammunition vessel, and when the torpedoes connect with that particular target, the result is one of those moments that stops every man aboard in his tracks. The ammunition ship does not just sink. It detonates. The explosion is enormous, catastrophic, spectacular beyond anything the crew of the Barb has ever witnessed. Shells and debris are launched hundreds of feet into the air. Fire rolls across the water. The concussion wave is felt even inside the submarine. By the time the chaos subsides, Flucky has sunk multiple ships and damaged several more. The Barb departs the area at high speed with her crew buzzing with adrenaline. But the biggest moment of this entire patrol is still 2 weeks away. It is now January 25th, 1945. The Barb has been hunting for targets, and Flucky has been doing what he always did, studying patterns, analyzing intelligence reports, listening to the radio traffic of the enemy, and thinking. Always thinking. And then he finds it. Through a combination of what his Medal of Honor citation later called brilliant deduction and bold tracking, Flucky locates something extraordinary. Tucked into the lower reaches of Namquan Harbor, sometimes recorded as Mamquan Harbor, along the Chinese coast, are more than 30 Japanese ships. 30 ships, sitting at anchor, hidden away in what the Japanese clearly believe is an absolutely secure location. And why would they not feel secure? The harbor is shallow, dangerously shallow. The water at the entrance is barely 10 fathoms deep and gets much worse from there. The entire area is laced with mines. There are rocks and sandbars that do not appear on any chart that Flucky possesses. The approaches are guarded by patrol vessels and escorts. And just to complete the picture, the harbor is 26 miles inside the 20-fathom curve, meaning any submarine attempting to get in and out would be operating in conditions where a single mistake would mean the end of everything. Now here is the thing about Commander Eugene Flucky. A lesser man, a more cautious man, a man with a more developed sense of personal self-preservation, would have looked at all of that and said, well, this one is not for us. He would have noted the position, reported it to headquarters, and moved on to a safer target. But Flucky looked at those 30 ships and saw something else entirely. He saw an opportunity so extraordinary that to pass it up would be almost a moral failing. He saw a chance to deliver a blow to the Japanese that no one would believe possible. And so, in the small hours of January 25, 1945, Commander Eugene Flucky gave the order that would define his entire career. Battle stations, torpedoes? What happened next required a level of seamanship and raw courage that is almost beyond comprehension. The Barb moved toward the harbor entrance in total darkness, feeling her way through water that was increasingly shallow, increasingly dangerous. Flucky had no charts for most of what lay ahead. He was navigating on instinct, on careful observation, on the kind of intuitive reading of the sea that only comes from years of experience and absolute focus. The submarine crept forward, her engines barely turning, the crew at their stations in complete silence. The depth beneath the keel shrank from 30 feet to barely more than the submarine's own draft in some places. Any moment, a mine could brush against the hull and end everything. Any moment, a patrol vessel could swing its searchlight in their direction and find them. But the darkness held, and the mines did not find them, and the Barb kept moving forward. Flucky brought his submarine to within 3,000 yards of the enemy ships before he acted. At that range, in those conditions, he was closer to his targets than almost any submarine commander had dared to get since the war began. He could see the dark shapes of the anchored ships against the slightly lighter sky. He could see lights aboard some of them, the casual, relaxed lights of a crew that had no idea that a hunter had just arrived in their midst. And then Flucky fired. He sent his forward torpedoes running into the packed anchorage, and then he swung the Barb around and fired again from his stern tubes. 8 torpedoes found their marks. 8 direct hits across 6 different targets. And then one of those targets, a large Japanese ammunition ship, reached the moment of its catastrophic end. Picture it if you can. The first torpedo strikes the hull of the ammunition ship somewhere around the waterline. The explosion tears through the outer plating and sends a cascade of fire deep into the vessel's interior, where hundreds of tons of shells, bombs, and other ordnance are stacked in the holds. For maybe a fraction of a second, there is a kind of terrible pause, a hesitation in the physics of the situation. And then everything lets go at once. The entire ship disappears inside a fireball that lights up the night sky for miles in every direction. The explosion is not just visible from the Barb. It is visible from ships and shoreline positions 10, 15, 20 miles away. Shells from the ammunition ship's cargo launch themselves skyward in every direction, arcing through the darkness and coming down on other vessels in the anchorage. One contemporary account said that from the bridge of the Barb, Flucky watched the Japanese ships erupting in the night like a nest of volcanoes. The Washington Post would later put those exact words into print. A nest of volcanoes. That is what one American submarine had just created in the middle of a harbor that was supposed to be impenetrable. Now here is the part of the story that makes it even more remarkable. The Japanese, in those first moments after the explosions began, did not know what had hit them. Their immediate assumption was that they were under attack by aircraft. Their searchlights swung upward, toward the sky, hunting for planes that did not exist. No one initially believed that a submarine could have gotten into that harbor. It was impossible. Everyone knew it was impossible. Except, of course, for Eugene Fluckey, who had apparently not received the memo about what submarines could and could not do. Fluckey took full advantage of the confusion. He had his window and he knew it would not last. The Barb's engines went to full power, and then beyond full power, running at what her engineering logs would later record as 150% overload. The submarine was racing through the mined, rock-strewn, uncharted shallows at over 23 knots, a speed that set an unofficial world record for a submarine of her type. Behind her, the harbor was a scene of chaos and fire and destruction. Around her, the enemy patrol vessels were finally beginning to understand what had happened and were mounting a response. A Japanese frigate opened fire. Shells splashed around the Barb, close but not close enough. A patrol aircraft roared overhead, its searchlight cutting through the dark water, looking for the attacker. But Fluckey kept the Barb moving, kept her twisting through the obstacles, kept her nose pointed toward open water and safety. For more than an hour, the USS Barb ran that gauntlet. 1 hour of threading through mines and rocks in total darkness at a speed that would have been reckless even in open water. 1 hour of watching enemy shells kick up spray within uncomfortable distances of the hull. 1 hour of holding his breath and trusting his instincts and driving his ship harder than any ship of her type had ever been driven before. And at the end of that hour, the Barb broke out into open water, and the immediate danger was behind them. Not a single crewman had been killed. Not a single crewman had been seriously injured. The Barb had sailed into the impossible and come out the other side intact. The Namquan Harbor attack, as it came to be known, was later called by the United States Navy virtually a suicide mission, and described as a naval epic. Commander Fluckey would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night and during the broader 11th Patrol. The citation specifically referenced both the January 8th sinking of the ammunition ship and the extraordinary events of January 25th. But here is what is remarkable about Eugene Fluckey. Even after receiving his nation's highest honor, even after conducting what the Navy itself called a naval epic, he was not done. He was not content to rest on accomplishments that would have satisfied a dozen lesser commanders. He still had more to give, more to try, more impossible things to accomplish. And so he negotiated with his superiors to lead the Barb on one more patrol, a 12th War Patrol, one final expedition into Japanese-controlled waters. And if you think the story has already reached its peak of audacity, just wait, because the 12th Patrol of the USS Barb contains a chapter so genuinely unbelievable that if it were presented as fiction, most editors would send it back with a note saying it was too far-fetched. The 12th Patrol began in June of 1945. The strategic situation had changed dramatically since Fluckey's earlier patrols. American forces were closing in on Japan from multiple directions. The Japanese merchant fleet had been devastated. Finding large convoys to attack had become increasingly difficult as fewer and fewer Japanese ships remained afloat. So when Fluckey was briefed for his 12th Patrol, the official mission objective was, in the memorable words of Admiral Lockwood, to raise a rumpus. That was apparently a direct quote. Go out there, 'cause problems, be creative, disrupt the enemy however you can. And for Eugene Fluckey, those instructions were basically an invitation to do things that no one had ever done before. The Barb departed on her 12th Patrol in June 1945. In the weeks that followed, she ranged widely across the northern Pacific, hitting targets of opportunity wherever she found them. Fluckey had by this point mounted a rocket launcher on the submarine's foredeck, a genuinely revolutionary innovation that made the Barb one of the first submarines in history capable of firing rockets at shore targets. On June 22, 1945, just one day after the fall of Okinawa, he gave the command "Man battle stations, rockets," and 12 rockets whooshed from the launcher and hit a Japanese coastal target 5,250 yards away, sending chunks of buildings flying into the night. The Barb took off at flank speed immediately afterwards, vanishing back into the darkness before the enemy could organize a response. It was submarine warfare being reimagined in real time, and Fluckey was writing the new manual as he went. But the single most extraordinary event of the 12th Patrol had nothing to do with rockets or torpedoes. It happened on the night of July 22nd and 23rd, 1945, in Patience Bay off the coast of Karafuto, which today forms the southern part of Sakhalin Island in the Russian Far East. Flucky had been watching the coastline during the days before and had noticed something that caught his attention. A Japanese railroad line ran very close to the shore. Trains moved along that line regularly, carrying troops and supplies. And Flucky, being Flucky, found himself wondering whether there was any reason why a submarine could not sink a train. Now think about that for a moment. Submarines sink ships. That is what they do. That is what they have always done. Nobody in the history of submarine warfare had ever seriously entertained the idea of sending a crew ashore from a submarine to blow up a railroad train. It was so far outside the established playbook that most people would not even have thought of it as a playbook problem. It simply would not have occurred to them. But to Flucky, it was just another creative solution to the problem of disrupting the enemy. He picked 8 volunteers from his crew, men who were willing to paddle ashore in a rubber raft onto the Japanese-held coastline at night, plant an explosive charge on the railroad tracks, and then paddle back to the submarine before anyone noticed they had been there. The plan was so audacious that even Flucky's own officers refused to let him join the shore party, threatening to report him to submarine headquarters if he tried. He belonged with the Barb, they said. So he watched from the submarine while 8 of his men paddled through the darkness toward the enemy shore. The team landed near Kashiho, Japan, and walked on the Japanese homeland. They planted their explosive charge on the tracks and then retreated to the water's edge to wait. They were listening for a train. And then they heard it, the distant rumble of an approaching locomotive. The charge was armed, and the team paddled furiously back toward the Barb, which was waiting less than 1,000 yards offshore in water so shallow that anyone walking along the beach at low tide might theoretically have seen them. The train arrived. The explosion detonated. The locomotive and several cars went up in a catastrophic blast. And 8 American sailors, aboard their rubber raft, felt the concussion wave rolling across the water toward them and knew that they had just done something that no one had ever done before. The 8 sailors who carried out that mission conducted what historians have since identified as the only ground combat operation by American forces on the Japanese homeland during the entire Second World War. So now let us step back for a moment and look at what Eugene Flucky and the USS Barb accomplished during their time together, because the full picture is staggering. Over 5 war patrols under Flucky's command, the Barb was officially credited by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee with destroying 95,360 tons of Japanese shipping, the highest total for any American submarine commander in the entire war. That translated to 16 ships confirmed sunk, plus the destruction of numerous smaller vessels, shore installations, and, of course, 1 Japanese train. Flucky received the Medal of Honor for Navy Crosses and a cascade of other decorations. The Barb herself received the Presidential Unit Citation for her 8th through 11th patrols and a Navy Unit Commendation for the 12th. Her battle flag was unlike any other ship's battle flag in the entire Navy, adorned not just with the symbols of ships sunk but with the image of a locomotive at the bottom, a permanent reminder that on one strange, wonderful, impossible night the USS Barb had sunk a train. But I want to go back to something because I think the ammunition ship moment from January 8th and the harbor attack from January 25th deserve more of our attention than they typically receive in the telling of this story. Those 2 events, just 17 days apart, represent something almost symphonic in their escalating audacity and their dramatic results. The January 8th attack on the convoy demonstrated everything that was brilliant about Flucky's approach. He had found the convoy in difficult conditions, had tracked it skillfully, and had attacked with precision and aggression. And then that ammunition ship had detonated, and the night had transformed into something biblical. But rather than treating that moment as the pinnacle of his achievements and heading for safer waters, Flucky had simply processed it as useful intelligence. He had learned something. He had confirmed something. He had seen what happened when a torpedo found the right target at the right moment. And he had filed that information away for future use. And then 17 days later, he had applied everything he had learned about aggression and surprise and the importance of striking before the enemy knows you are there, and he had translated it into the most daring harbor attack of the Pacific War. The Namquan attack did not come from nowhere. It came from a commander who had spent months learning his enemy, learning his own ship, and learning what was possible when you refused to accept conventional limits. Every patrol had taught him something. Every engagement had refined his instincts. And on January 25, 1945, all of that learning came together in a single night of extraordinary action. Now let us also take a moment to honor the crew of the USS Barb, because in every account of this story, it is easy to focus entirely on Flucky, and he deserves every word that has been written about him. But he was the first to say, and he said it repeatedly for the rest of his long life, that the crew of the Barb was the real story. These were young men, most of them teenagers and men in their early 20s, who had volunteered for submarine duty knowing full well that it was the most dangerous assignment in the entire United States Navy. Submarines operated alone, in enemy waters, without any realistic hope of rescue if something went wrong. The casualty rate for American submarines in the Pacific was higher than almost any other branch of service. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, taking their crews with them to the bottom of the ocean. Every man who climbed down the hatch and sailed on a war patrol knew that those were the stakes. And they went anyway. The crew of the Barb went further than most. They followed their commander into situations that were, by any objective measure, suicidal. They sailed into mined harbors in the dark. They ran at 150% engine overload through waters that no chart could describe. They paddled rubber rafts onto enemy shores. And they came home. Every one of them through all of that came home. Not a single crewman of the USS Barb was killed during her 5 war patrols under Flucky's command. In the official patrol report for the Nam Quan Harbor attack, there is a line that has always struck me as extraordinarily moving. It notes that although the Barb was attacked with shells, bombs, and depth charges throughout the patrol, no one received the Purple Heart and the Barb came back alive, eager, and ready to fight again. Alive, eager, and ready. That is the crew of the USS Barb in 3 words. The broader context of American submarine warfare in the Pacific is important to understand here as well, because the USS Barb's achievements did not exist in isolation. They were part of the most devastating submarine campaign in naval history. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk 611 Japanese naval vessels and more than 2,100 merchant ships, accounting for an enormous proportion of Japan's total naval losses. Submarines sank more than half of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war. They strangled the Japanese war economy, cutting off the flow of oil, raw materials, food, and military supplies that Japan desperately needed to sustain its fighting forces. The Japanese Empire was built on its ability to project power across the vast distances of the Pacific, and it was the American submarine force, operating in terrible conditions with extraordinary bravery, that systematically dismantled that capability. Every ship that went to the bottom took with it not just steel and machinery but the irreplaceable ability to support Japanese forces in the field. The personal cost of this campaign to the American submariners who fought it cannot be overstated. Those 52 submarines that were lost during the war represented more than 3,500 American lives, young men who went on patrol and never came back. The ratio of casualties among submarine crews was higher than in virtually any other branch of the United States military during the Second World War. And yet the volunteers kept coming, kept training, kept sailing out into those dangerous waters. The submarines of the United States Navy in the Second World War were crewed by some of the most remarkable people their country ever produced. Let us talk for a moment about what the Nam Quan Harbor attack meant in a larger strategic sense, because it was not just spectacular. It was genuinely significant. The harbor had been considered safe. The Japanese ships anchored there were waiting for their next assignment, carrying supplies and materials that were desperately needed elsewhere. When Flucky destroyed 6 of them in a single night, he did not just create a spectacular explosion visible for miles. He removed those ships from the Japanese strategic picture permanently. Ammunition ships, cargo vessels, supply transports, they were the lifeblood of the Japanese military presence across Asia and the Pacific. Every one that sank represented a failure that could not be easily replaced. Japan's shipbuilding capacity had been badly eroded by this point in the war. Ships lost in harbors like Nam Quan were not being rebuilt. They were simply gone. And then there is the psychological dimension, which is harder to quantify but no less real. The Japanese military had been sending ships into harbors like Nam Quan precisely because those harbors were supposed to be immune to submarine attack. The shallow water, the mines, the rock obstacles, all of it was meant to guarantee safety. When Flucky proved that none of it mattered to a sufficiently skilled and determined commander, the effect on Japanese strategic planning was significant. Where exactly were their ships safe? If a mined, rock-strewn, chartless harbor 26 miles inside the shallow water limit was not safe, then nothing was truly safe. The psychological pressure that the American submarine campaign placed on Japanese naval planners throughout the war is a story that has never been fully told, but it was very real and very consequential. By the summer of 1945, the war was moving toward its end by means that even the most far-sighted analysts could not have predicted in their details. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th, followed by Nagasaki on August 9th, accelerated Japan's decision to surrender dramatically. The USS Barb was in the waters off the Japanese coast on her 12th patrol when news of the surrender reached her. In a strange kind of symmetry, the Barb's crew were still out there, still operating, still raising their rumpus as ordered, when the war they had been fighting suddenly ended. Flucky heard the news from the submarine's radio, and by his own account, the crew celebrated with the kind of joy that only people who have spent years doing the most dangerous job imaginable can truly feel when the danger is finally over. Eugene Flucky went on to a distinguished post-war career in the United States Navy. He served in a variety of senior positions, rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. He commanded submarine divisions, served on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations, and ultimately served as Commander Submarine Force Pacific and as Director of Naval Intelligence. In 1972, after 37 years on active duty, he retired. He had spent a career worth of distinction earning. In 1992, nearly 50 years after the events we have been discussing today, he published his memoir. He called it Thunder Below, and it quickly became recognized as one of the definitive accounts of American submarine warfare in the Pacific. In it, he was careful to credit not himself but his crew with everything the Barb had accomplished. He described his Medal of Honor as belonging to all of them. He wrote about his men with a warmth and a respect that made clear the depth of the bond that had formed during those years of shared danger and shared accomplishment. Flucky died on June 28, 2007, at the age of 93. His mind eventually dimmed by Alzheimer's disease, but his legacy intact and enduring. He is buried at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis, Maryland, which seems entirely appropriate for a man who devoted so much of his life to the service of his country. The boat he commanded is gone now, transferred to Italy in the mid-1950s and eventually scrapped. But her story remains, and the battle flag that flew from her mast, with its rows of enemy ship symbols and its image of a locomotive at the bottom, is preserved as a reminder of what she and her crew accomplished. What, then, should we take away from all of this? What is the lesson of the USS Barb, of Commander Eugene Flucky, of the night that an American submarine sailed into an impossible harbor and blew up a Japanese ammunition ship so completely that people 20 miles away thought a volcano had erupted? I think there are several things worth sitting with. The first is the power of creative leadership. Every submarine commander in the Pacific had the same basic tools available to them. They all had torpedoes. They all had crews of brave, trained men. They all operated in the same difficult, dangerous environment. What separated Flucky from the merely competent was not his tools but his willingness to use them in ways that had never been tried before. He looked at his submarine and saw a rocket platform, a shore raider, a high-speed surface attacker, and a harbor infiltrator, not just a conventional submerged weapon. That expansive vision, that refusal to be limited by what submarines were supposed to do, is what made him extraordinary. The second lesson is about the relationship between courage and calculation. It would be easy to look at the Nam Quan Harbor attack and see only recklessness, only a man who was willing to throw caution aside and hope for the best. But that is not what Flucky was doing. He calculated everything he could calculate. He studied the available intelligence, he assessed the water depth, he planned his approach and his escape route. He timed his attack for the moment of maximum darkness and minimum enemy readiness. The courage was real, but it was courage in service of a plan, not courage as a substitute for thinking. That combination, the willingness to take on something terrifying combined with the mental discipline to maximize the chances of success, is what distinguishes genuine military excellence from simple recklessness. The third lesson is about what teams can accomplish when they genuinely trust each other. The crew of the Barb trusted Flucky, and Flucky trusted his crew. He knew that when he asked them to do something extraordinary, they would do it. They knew that when he took them into danger, he had thought it through and would do everything in his power to bring them back alive. That mutual trust, built over months and years of shared experience, was what made the impossible possible. No single commander, however brilliant, could have done what Flucky did alone. The Barb was a team achievement, and Flucky knew it better than anyone. And finally, there is the simple, powerful reminder that history is full of stories that deserve to be told more widely than they currently are. The name Eugene Flucky should be as well known as any hero this country has produced. The story of the USS Barb, of the night she sailed into Nam Quan Harbor and turned it into a nest of volcanoes, should be taught in every classroom where American history is discussed. The image of that ammunition ship going up in a fireball visible for miles, of those 8 sailors paddling a rubber raft back from the Japanese homeland, of a submarine running at 150% engine overload through mine shallows in the dark. These are images that deserve a permanent place in the national memory. The men who served on American submarines during the Second World War gave everything their country asked of them and more. They operated in conditions of extraordinary danger, often without recognition and frequently without the kind of public attention that more visible branches of the service received. They called themselves the Silent Service, and that name was apt in more ways than one. They fought in silence, they often suffered in silence, and their achievements have been remembered in relative silence compared to the great battles and great commanders that dominate the popular history of the war. Stories like the one we have told today are a reminder that the silence has always been undeserved. So the next time you think about the Pacific War, the next time you think about what ordinary human beings can accomplish when the stakes are existential and the cause is just, think about Commander Eugene Flucky at his periscope in the early hours of January 25, 1945. Think about the 30 Japanese ships at anchor in a harbor that was supposed to be inviolable. Think about the water that was barely deep enough to float a submarine. Think about the mines that were waiting in the darkness for anyone foolish enough to try what he was trying. And then think about him giving the order anyway. Battle stations, torpedoes, and a fireball that lit up the night sky for miles. Some stories are important because they changed the course of history. Some are important because they illustrate principles we need to remember. And some are important simply because they are true, because they happened, because real human beings with real fear and real courage actually did the things described. The story of the USS Barb and Commander Eugene Lucky Flucky is all three of those things at once. And it deserves to be told, and remembered, and told again. Thank you for spending this time with us today. If this story moved you the way it moves me every time I come back to it, please share it with someone who might not know it yet. These stories survive because people keep telling them. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And until then, remember the Barb, remember Flucky, and remember that the word impossible has always been a challenge, not a verdict.